This is part 2 of this writing exercise. We're going to be talking about anthropomorphism. So let me tell you what anthropomorphism is. It's a very long word, but it's pretty simple about what it is. And it's something we don't want to use in scientific writing style. So anthropomorphism is the attribution of human intentions, actions, or emotions onto animals, plants, objects, or other non-human things. So applying human characteristics onto non-human things or objects. So if you look at this cat, you might think, this is just an example, that the cat looks like he's thinking, or it's daydreaming maybe. Okay, but as far as we know, animals, with the exception of maybe dolphins, we don't know, have that ability to have higher order thinking, to create stories in their own minds. So this is an example of anthropomorphism. As far as we understand, daydreaming is only a human characteristic. So applying it to an animal is an example. But today I want to talk to you more about how I see it occurring in writing. And here's some examples of what I see students using anthropomorphism. The book says, or the book states, or the article analyzed. I've never sat down and actually had a conversation with a book, so I don't think a book can either state or say anything. Likewise, an article doesn't have the human ability to analyze anything. So therefore, this is another example of anthropomorphism. And as I mentioned, this is not something that is used particularly in APA citation style. So here's an example of a list of verbs that would be considered anthropomorphism. If you applied any of these at the top, journal articles describe, or books investigated, or results explored, any of that would be an example of anthropomorphism, because none of the articles, books, studies, or results can do any of these human things because they're not human. One verb I want to point out is prove or proved. I see this a lot in student papers, and I want you to be particularly careful when using this verb. And to remind you, in scientific study, our goal is not to prove anything. In fact, the whole goal of scientific study is to have a hypothesis and find evidence for either to retain or reject that hypothesis. So we'll never really prove anything. That would be more like scientific law, like the law of gravity. Or in a court of law, they might want to use the verb prove. However, in scientific study, generally what we do is find evidence for, or to retain or reject a hypothesis. Again, so any of these verbs are just examples, and there are many others. If you put the word book in front of it, it could be considered a form of anthropomorphism because they're not human. So an example of what that might look like in a student paper or writing is the example I provide here. The study examined how a mother's depressive symptoms during infancy has a consequential impact on the child's attention span and executive function in grade school. So we know that a study in and of itself, an article, a study, cannot examine anything. That is not a characteristic. It's a human characteristic that a study cannot do, but humans can do that. Humans can examine. So one trick around anthropomorphism is to use that narrative citation. So for example, Wang and Dix, who were the authors of this article that you're paraphrasing here, can examine. So therefore, just use that narrative citation, and it removes the anthropomorphic writing. Likewise, another example, the article hypothesized. Well, an article can't hypothesize at all, even if it wanted to. But Wang and Dix can hypothesize. So again, use that narrative citation. This can be really helpful to your audience, to your reader. If you're writing a paper that has multiple articles that you're referring to, by using that narrative citation, the reader can kind of identify which article you're referring to easily. And you don't need to include the title of the article. A reader can go to your reference list and find that. Just use the author's last names. Number one, it gets rid of the anthropomorphism, and number two, it helps the reader along. It guides them through what you're trying to say. There are some verbs that are acceptable and can be applied to theories, results, and studies or data without confusion. These are APA pre-approved verbs that work in this context. So, in fact, in the last APA publication style, they just decided that these are acceptable. Okay, so examples of that would be the results showed, the theory suggested, the data presents, or the studies provided. These are all just examples of ways that you can acceptably use verbs when describing what a non-human thing does. These are all okay. Now, you don't have to memorize this list, but you should always check your papers to make sure that you're not using anthropomorphism. And in fact, even in this acceptable list, you might want to just use that narrative citation, number one, for ease, but also for clarity for the reader. The last thing I want to mention about anthropomorphism is there's another way around it. You can say, and it's grammatically okay to say, the author said, the researchers found, the investigator discovered, whatever verb you want to insert here, that is okay, as long as it's an actual human being you're describing what their action is. So for this example here, this is just an article that I found and picked up. Okay, so it'd be okay to use that narrative citation again, and to make it just easier for you. Get into that habit. It's really helpful. You might find it redundant over time when you're doing, especially in the literature review, where you're switching between articles, sometimes within the same paragraph. But again, it helps the reader to follow along. The last thing I want to mention is that most of us think we don't have anthropomorphism in our papers, but this is when revision becomes really helpful. Before you turn in a paper, you should definitely go back in and check for both economy of expression and anthropomorphism and fix those before submitting. Thanks so much for listening today. I hope you found it useful.